Conrad Wexler's hand closed around Amina's wrist before she could step back from the elevator. His grip was firm, not enough to bruise, too calculated for that, but enough to stop her retreat. Her phone slipped from her other hand, clattering against the marble floor as he pulled her toward the open doors, his smile never faltering. "Don't make this difficult," he murmured, his voice smooth as expensive scotch. Behind him, Sienna Vale held the elevator button, her diamond bracelet catching the chandelier light. The private suite was waiting on the 7th floor. The cameras were already recording. For a moment, the ballroom music seemed to fade. Amina looked up at the man who'd just cornered her against Seoul's most elegant elevator, Conrad Wexler, venture capitalist, art collector, a man whose name opened doors across 3 continents. Miles stood 20 feet away, arms crossed, making sure she didn't run. Regina watched from the service entrance with cold satisfaction. "The client wants you specifically," Miles had said 10 minutes earlier, like it was a compliment. Conrad had no idea what he'd just done. No idea that the panicked text Amina had sent 60 seconds ago hadn't gone to her best friend Bree like she'd intended. No idea that it had landed in the phone of the one man in Seoul who didn't care about Conrad's net worth, his connections, or his lawyers. No idea about the 3-word response that was making Amina's heart hammer for an entirely different reason now. "Stay put, I'm coming." No idea about the black-shirted figure currently cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk, security parting without being asked. No idea about the tattoos that made grown men step aside, or the reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. And Conrad definitely had no idea about Han Tae-hyun, Seoul's most dangerous underground king whose phone was still in his hand, whose eyes had just locked onto Conrad's fingers wrapped around Amina's wrist, and whose next words would change the power dynamics of the entire room. Amina smoothed the starch-stiffened fabric of her apron, the white surface a mocking contrast to the dark bruising of exhaustion under her eyes. For 2 years, Seoul had been less of a city and more of a gilded treadmill. She measured time not in seasons, but in the relentless rhythm of double shifts and the digital receipts of wire transfers sent to her younger siblings back home. Every one earned was a textbook for her sister or a meal for her brother, leaving Amina with just enough to maintain the invisible, impeccable veneer required by the Aurelia Gala. Tonight, the venue was a cathedral of excess, teeming with celebrities whose smiles were as choreographed as the political maneuvers being whispered over crystal flutes of vintage Bollinger. The air hummed with the scent of lilies and cold, hard cash. But behind the swinging kitchen doors, the atmosphere was surgical. Regina Whitman paced the line of staff like a general inspecting a doomed platoon, her gaze sharp enough to draw blood. "Look at the floor, not the guests," Regina barked, her voice a low hiss that cut through the clatter of silver. "You are ghosts in navy blue. Smile. Comply. If a guest asks for the moon, you find a ladder. Do not embarrass me, or you'll find yourselves on the street before the first course is cleared." Amina stepped onto the ballroom floor, her tray balanced with a grace born of necessity. She moved through the crowd, a shadow among the light, catching fragments of the casual cruelty that served as the evening's background noise. At a table of tech moguls, a man laughed about a private party scheduled for later upstairs, his eyes roaming over a young hostess with a terrifying, proprietary hunger. His companions chuckled, the sound thick with the comfort of men who knew their checkbooks were shields against any consequence. Amina's grip tightened on her tray as she passed Miles Kerr. The floor supervisor was deep in conversation with a regular patron, his posture subservient, yet his eyes remained predatory as they tracked Amina's movement. He didn't see a woman with dreams or a family. He saw a high-value asset in a white apron. "She's a fresh one," Miles whispered to the guest, loud enough for Amina to catch, and remarkably compliant. The guest grinned, a slow, oily expression that made Amina's skin crawl. Management didn't just look the other way. They paved the road for the monsters in tuxedos. To Regina and Miles, the staff were merely items on a menu, And as the gala reached its fever pitch, Amina realized with a sinking heart that her name was finally being called. The golden double doors of the ballroom swung open with a practiced flourish, heralding the arrival of the night's most anticipated guest. Conrad Wexler moved through the crowd like a wolf in a bespoke tuxedo, his presence commanding a sudden sycophantic hush from the nearby tables. With his entourage trailing behind him like a wake of expensive silk and sharp perfume, he donned a mask of effortless charm for the donors, shaking hands and offering polished anecdotes that elicited practiced laughter. Yet, as he passed the service line, the mask slipped. His eyes, cold and predatory, swept over the waitstaff as if they were nothing more than faulty pieces of furniture. Amina kept her head bowed, focusing on the weight of the silver tray in her hands, but she could feel the heat of a gaze boring into her. Wexler leaned toward Miles, whispering something that made the supervisor's posture straighten with sudden, oily intent. Moments later, Miles was at Amina's elbow, his hand clamping onto her shoulder with a grip that was far too familiar. "Change of plans, Carter?" Miles murmured, a disturbing leer stretching his thin lips. "Mr. Wexler has requested you specifically for his private bottle service. He noticed your attention to detail." "I'm assigned to the terrace tables, Miles," Amina whispered, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "Bree can handle the VIPs. Miles's grip tightened, his fingernails digging into the navy blue fabric of her uniform. Regina was very clear. "Mr. Wexler is a founding donor, and he is feeling very generous tonight. She expects you to take care of him, Amina. Every single need." He emphasized the words with a suggestive nod toward the grand staircase. "Don't ruin your life over a tray of drinks." As Miles pulled away to grovel at Wexler's side, Amina felt the air in the ballroom grow thin. She ducked into the service pantry to grab the requested vintage, her hands trembling so violently the glass bottles clinked together like a warning bell. "Amina, stop." Bree appeared from the shadows of the prep station, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. She grabbed Amina's wrists, forcing her to look up. "You can't go up there!" I caught a glimpse of the guest list for the private lounge upstairs. "It's not just drinks, Mina. I've heard things about what happens in those rooms once the doors are locked. Girls don't come back the same if they come back at all." Amina looked at the heavy, gold-embossed bottle in her hands, then out at the glittering gala where Wexler sat watching the door like a hunter at a watering hole. The golden cage of the Aurelia was no longer a metaphor, it was a trap, and the teeth were about to snap shut. "I don't have a choice, Bree," Amina whispered, her voice fracturing. Regina said comply or be on the street. She straightened her apron, took a shallow breath, and stepped back out into the light, unaware that the message she was about to send in desperation was already destined for the most dangerous phone in the city. The golden tray felt like a lead weight in Amina's hands as she made one final, desperate attempt to turn back toward the safety of the kitchens. But Regina Whitman was already there, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving against the ballroom's glow. "I can't do this, Regina," Amina pleaded, her voice barely a thread of sound. "Please, just send someone else." Regina didn't even blink. She stepped closer, the scent of her expensive perfume cloying and suffocating. "Let's be very clear about your position here, Amina," she whispered, her eyes narrow and predatory. "You are replaceable. Girls like you are a dime a dozen in this city, and I have a stack of resumes on my desk from people who would crawl through broken glass for this wage. You go up those stairs, or you don't bother coming back for your final check. The choice is yours, but I suggest you remember who is paying for your siblings' tuition." Amina turned, her eyes searching for an exit, but Miles Kerr had moved with practiced precision to block the service corridor. He stood, with his arms crossed, a smug, immovable wall of navy polyester. Just as the panic began to rise in her throat, a hand draped in shimmering silk settled on Amina's shoulder. It was Sienna Vale, Wexler's companion, wearing a smile that was as curated and hollow as the rest of the gala. "Oh, look at you. You're practically trembling." Sienna cooed, her false sympathy dripping like honey over a blade. "It's just drinks, honey. Don't be so dramatic. Conrad just finds you charming, and he's in such a celebratory mood tonight. Don't spoil the evening for everyone." Her laugh was like shattering crystal, cold and devoid of warmth, as she gently but firmly steered Amina toward the private VIP elevator. The chime of the elevator was a death knell. As the brushed steel doors slid open, Conrad Wexler stepped forward, his eyes dark with a triumphant hunger that made the blood freeze in Amina's veins. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out, his hand settling heavily on the small of her back. The touch was possessive, a silent declaration of ownership that burned through her uniform. As he guided her into the small, mirrored box of the elevator, Amina's hand dove into her apron pocket. Her fingers found the cold, sleek surface of her smartphone, her last remaining connection to a world where she had a choice. With her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she didn't look at the screen. She relied on muscle memory, her thumb flying across the glass to pull up the contact she thought was her best friend. "VIP table wants me upstairs. I'm scared." The send button clicked just as the elevator began its silent, smooth ascent toward the top floor. Amina watched the floor numbers glow 10, 11, 12, unaware that her message had bypassed Bree entirely and was currently vibrating in the pocket of Han Tae-hyun, the only man in Seoul who didn't take orders from people like Conrad Wexler. The elevator doors were a breath away from closing when a heavy, tattooed hand caught the steel edge, forcing the sensors to recoil. The mechanical chime was drowned out by a sudden, unnatural silence that swept through the ballroom like a cold front. Below, the glittering gala had frozen. Heads turned, whispers died in throats, and the air grew heavy with the kind of primal fear that only follows the arrival of a true apex predator. Han Tae-hyun stepped into the light, his black dress shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the dark ink of a dragon coiling across his chest, its tail disappearing beneath his collar. Beside him, Choi Sung-ho stood like a mountain of granite, his silent, watchful presence signaling that this was not a social visit, but an incursion. Conrad Wexler tightened his grip on Amina's back, his face flushing with the indignant rage of a man who had never been interrupted. Being an outsider to Seoul's deeper shadows, he saw only a man with tattoos and an attitude. "This is a private lift, pal," Conrad snapped, his voice echoing off the mirrored walls. "Get lost before I have security throw you out." Tae-hyun didn't look at Conrad. He didn't even acknowledge the man existed. His dark, focused eyes were locked onto Amina's trembling form, and specifically, the hand Wexler had clamped onto her waist. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, making the champagne bottles on Amina's tray rattle. He stepped into the confined space of the elevator, moving with a predatory grace that made the air feel dangerously thin. "You have 10 seconds to remove your hand," Tae-hyun said, his voice a deadly, low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Amina's bones. "Who the hell do you think?" Conrad started. But the words died as Sung-ho stepped forward, his shadow eclipsing the light. The realization finally hit Wexler. The security he intended to call was currently standing at the ballroom exits, bowing their heads in silent deference to the man in front of him. Tae-hyun reached out, his fingers catching Amina's wrist with a surprising, calloused gentleness that acted as an anchor for her spiraling panic. With a slow, deliberate movement, he peeled Conrad's hand away as if it were a piece of stray lint. "I believe this is my +1 for the evening," Tae-hyun stated, his tone as final as a slamming vault door. He pulled Amina toward him, shielding her with his own body. Then, he looked at Conrad for the first time, his expression as stoic and cold as a winter grave. "You're dismissed. Pray I don't see you on the next floor." The power shift was instantaneous and absolute. Conrad stumbled back against the mirrored wall, his bravado evaporating into a cold sweat as the elevator doors finally hissed shut, leaving Amina trapped not with a predator, but with the man who owned the jungle. The elevator ascended in a suffocating, metallic silence. The only sound, the frantic thrum of Amina's heart. When the doors slid open on the penthouse level, the air was different, heavy, with the scent of lilies masking something chemical and sharp. Tae-hyun didn't let Amina go. His hand remained a steady, grounding force on her wrist as he stepped out, Sung-ho following like a silent reaper. Conrad Wexler trailed behind them, his face a mask of twitching nerves, trying to reclaim his shattered ego. "Look, Mr. Kong, or whoever you are," Conrad began, his voice cracking as they reached the double doors of the Imperial Suite. "This is just a misunderstanding between gentlemen. A little private party among friends." Tae-hyun didn't answer. He kicked the doors open. The room was not a lounge. It was a hunting blind. Hidden behind the velvet curtains were high-end digital cameras on tripods, their red recording lights blinking like malevolent eyes. In the center of the room, 3 other women in service uniforms sat huddled on a low sofa, their ankles bound by silk restraints, their faces vacant with a terror that had long since surpassed screaming. A heavy medical kit sat open on the glass coffee table, filled with vials that had no labels. Amina's tray slipped from her fingers, the champagne bottles shattering on the hardwood. The sound was a starting pistol. Conrad lunged forward, reaching for a phone on the bar. "I can explain. It's performance art. We pay them well, I swear." Taehyun's reaction was a blur of lethal precision. He didn't hit Conrad. He simply stepped into his space, his presence so overwhelming that the billionaire collapsed into a chair as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Tae-hyun looked at the cameras, then at the trembling women, and finally at Conrad. The dragon on his neck seemed to writhe as his jaw tightened, his eyes turning into shards of black ice. "You made a mistake tonight, Wexler," Tae-hyun whispered, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. "Probably your last." He pulled a sleek, encrypted phone from his pocket and pressed a single button. He didn't wait for a greeting. "The Imperial Suite, Aurelia. Clean it up," he said, then ended the call. Conrad began to blubber, offering bank accounts, offshore holdings, and names of politicians. Tae-hyun ignored the noise, turning his back to the predator to shield Amina from the sight of the room. Less than 3 minutes later, the floor vibrated with the heavy thud of tactical boots. The doors burst open once more as Agent Marcus Reed led a team of plainclothes investigators into the suite. Reed didn't look surprised to see the Mafia boss standing in the center of a crime scene. "Coincidental timing, Agent," Tae-hyun remarked dryly, his fingers tightening protectively around Amina's hand. "The most reliable coincidences always come from your phone calls, Tae-hyun," Reed replied, his eyes taking in the cameras and the bound women. "Secure the perimeter. No one leaves this floor, especially not the ones in tuxedos." As the room dissolved into the chaos of an arrest, Amina felt the world tilt. She had sent a text to a monster, only to find he was the only thing standing between her and a nightmare. The chaos of the suite became a blurred montage of flickering blue police lights and the clinical clicking of forensic cameras. Amina sat on the edge of a velvet ottoman, a shock blanket draped over her navy uniform, her hands still vibrating with a chill that no fabric could reach. Across the room, Conrad Wexler was being shoved into zip ties, his frantic bargaining dying into a whimper as the reality of his ruin set in. Agent Marcus Reed stepped into Amina's line of sight, his shadow momentarily cutting off the light from the hallway. He leaned in, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that felt like a warning. "You're safe, for now, Miss Carter. But you need to understand the company you're keeping. The man who brought us here, Tae-hyun, isn't a guardian angel. He's the head of an organization that makes Wexler look like a petty thief. He's a criminal, Amina. Don't let the rescue fool you into thinking he's a hero." Tae-hyun didn't flinch at the accusation. He stood a few feet away, illuminated by the cold glow of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked like a king surveying a battlefield he had already won. "He isn't lying," Tae-hyun said, his voice level and devoid of apology as he turned to face her. The dragon ink on his neck seemed to darken in the shadows. I am exactly what he says I am. I deal in blood and secrets, not charity. He stepped closer, his presence commanding the space between the law and the victim. But Reed needs your testimony to make sure Wexler and his associates never see the sun again. Without you, the evidence is just noise. My protection has a price, Amina. Your courage. He paused, his dark eyes searching hers with a terrifying sincerity. I'll keep you breathing. I'll make sure the people who own this city can't touch you while you burn their world down. Once the verdict is read, you walk away. No strings. You'll be truly free. Amina looked from the stern, tired face of the investigator to the stoic, dangerous man who had answered a stranger's text. Why? She whispered, the question finally tearing through her throat. You don't know me. You could have ignored it. Why do you care what happens to a waitress from the Aurelia? Taehyun reached out, his thumb grazing the edge of the shock blanket. A gesture so unexpectedly tender, it made her breath catch. Because you asked for help, he replied, the simplicity of the statement hitting harder than any threat. In my world, a distress call is a debt. You reached out into the dark, Amina. It just so happens that I am the one who lives there, and I never ignore a call for help. The weight of the choice settled in her chest. She was caught between a predator she knew and a devil who had saved her life, but as she looked at Taehyun, she realized for the first time that she was no longer a ghost in a navy blue shirt. She was a witness, and the most dangerous man in Seoul was waiting for her to find her voice. The days following the raid were a blur of cold interrogation rooms and the sterile hum of a safe house. Under Taehyun's guard, the glittering facade of the Aurelia Gala didn't just crack, it disintegrated. As Agent Reed combed through the encrypted files seized from the suite, the true architecture of the nightmare emerged. Regina Whitman hadn't just been a demanding manager, she was a broker. The restaurant served as a high-end showroom where Miles Kerr scouted the most vulnerable staff, grooming them for private service before delivering them to the upstairs suites. Conrad Wexler, despite his millions, was revealed to be nothing more than a high-paying consumer, a frequent flyer in a much darker sky. The real architect was a shadow that even Taehyun's extensive intelligence had failed to map. Lee Ji-hoon, the third-generation heir to the Seonggwang Group. Lee hadn't built this network for money. He built it for leverage. By recording the illicit appetites of Seoul's most powerful men in the Aurelia's private suites, he had created a library of blackmail that kept the city's political and industrial rivals on their knees. Amina sat at a heavy metal table, her eyes fixed on the photos Reed spread before her. The luxury she had once admired now looked like a crime scene. "You're the only one, Amina," Reed said, his voice heavy with the gravity of the situation. The other women were drugged too heavily to identify the handlers. You're the only witness who saw Miles, Regina, and Wexler interacting with Lee's personal security. Without your signature on these depositions, Lee Ji-hoon walks, and this entire operation just moves to a different hotel. The stakes had shifted from a personal rescue to a national scandal, and the pressure was a physical weight. The web of lies was vast, and Amina was the fly that had finally glimpsed the spider. To the legal system, she was the golden witness, the key to a historic conviction. To the Seonggwang Group, she was a loose thread that needed to be cut. Taehyun stood by the reinforced door, his silhouette a grim reminder of the violence required to keep her alive. He watched as she traced the edges of the evidence. He knew that the traffickers weren't just looking for a legal loophole. They were looking for her silence, and they were willing to pay for it in blood. The devil, she knew, was her only shield against the polished monsters who wore three-piece suits and sat in boardrooms. Amina looked up at the camera in the corner of the room, realizing that her voice was now the most dangerous weapon in Seoul, and every power player in the city was waiting to see if she would have the courage to pull the trigger. The silence of the safe house shattered at 3 in the morning. A muffled thud, the hiss of a suppressed muzzle, and the sudden, crystalline spray of the kitchen window turning into diamonds. Amina didn't even have time to scream before Taehyun's weight slammed into her, pinning her to the cold floor as a second round whistled through the space where her head had been moments before. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a machine awakening. Within seconds, Sung-ho was in the room, his return fire a rhythmic thunder that forced the shadows back into the night. "Stay down," Taehyun commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He didn't wait for the police. He didn't wait for a report. The attempt on her life was the final tether snapped, and the ice of his composure evaporated into a fire that would consume the city's skyline. Over the next 48 hours, Amina watched through the monitors of a secondary subterranean location as Taehyun unleashed a biblical retribution. He didn't just strike back, he dismantled. One by one, the legitimate fronts of the Seonggwang Group, the logistics warehouses in Incheon, the shell company offices in Gangnam, the private clubs where the recruiters met went dark. Some were hit by sudden, aggressive buyouts that liquidated their assets. Others were simply reduced to ash and twisted metal under the cover of night. Agent Reed burst into the command center, his face a mask of frantic rage, a stack of warrants trembling in his hand. "Stop this, Taehyun! You're burning the crime scenes! You're contaminating every piece of evidence I need for a clean trial. I can't convict Lee Ji-hoon if you turn his entire paper trail into smoke." Taehyun didn't even look up from the maps spread across the table. He was marking a final location, a safe house, where Miles Kerr was rumored to be hiding. "Then work faster, Agent," he replied, his tone as sharp and cold as a scalpel. "You play by a rulebook that these men have rewritten to favor themselves. I don't. They tried to kill the only person in this city who speaks for the forgotten. I'm not just destroying a business, I'm erasing a virus." Amina sat in the corner, watching the man she had come to rely on. She saw the terrifying efficiency of his violence, the way he moved with the precision of a hurricane, but she also saw the strange, unyielding code that governed it. Not a single innocent worker was harmed in the raids. The civilians were ushered out of the warehouses before the fires were lit. His fury was surgical, reserved exclusively for the predators who had spent years preying on the powerless. As the sun began to rise over a city that felt fundamentally changed, Amina realized that, while Taehyun might not be a hero by Reed's definition, he was the only one willing to do the terrible things necessary to ensure she stayed alive to tell the truth. The heavy mahogany doors of the high court swung open, admitting a woman the world no longer recognized as a ghost in navy blue. Amina walked toward the witness stand, the delicate click of her heels echoing through a courtroom packed with the very elite who had once looked through her as if she were made of glass. Behind the bulletproof partition, Conrad Wexler, Regina Whitman, and Miles Kerr sat in a row, their designer suits rumpled, their faces pale under the fluorescent glare of justice. When the prosecutor asked her to describe the events at the Aurelia, Amina didn't look at the defendants. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the back of the room, where a man in a black dress shirt stood with his arms crossed, the ink on his neck a dark promise of stability. Her voice didn't tremble. It was a steady, rhythmic fire that burned through the web of lies, detailing every coercion, every camera, and every broken promise. By the time she finished, the silence in the court was absolute. The fall was swift. With Amina's testimony as the anchor, the prosecution secured convictions for the entire ring. Regina and Miles were led away in shackles. Their legacy of exploitation ended. Conrad Wexler's empire was liquidated to pay for the damages of a dozen victims. And while the Chaebol heir, Lee Ji-hoon, managed to flee the country on a private jet before the handcuffs could click, he left behind a ruined name and a confiscated fortune. 6 months later, the Phoenix Protocol opened its doors in a quiet, leafy corner of Seoul. It wasn't a gilded cage, but a sanctuary, a safe house, and 2 4-hour hotline dedicated to the service workers the city ignored. Amina stood at the podium during the opening ceremony, no longer a waitress, but a founder. She spoke of resilience and the power of a single voice to disrupt a symphony of corruption. As the crowd dispersed, she spotted a familiar silhouette standing in the shadow of a ginkgo tree at the edge of the property. Han Tae-hyun looked exactly as he had the night of the gala, lethal, stoic, and apart from the world of light. Amina stepped away from the cameras, walking toward him until the scent of his cologne and the weight of his presence felt like home. "You did it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "We did it," she corrected softly. She reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of his shirt. "Thank you for answering, Tae-hyun. I know it wasn't the right number." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a rare break in the stone. He bowed his head slightly, the dragon on his neck dipping with the movement. "Thank you for calling, Amina. You gave me a reason to remember why I fight." He turned and vanished into the evening mist, leaving her standing in the light of the sanctuary she had built. As she walked back toward the door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, smiling at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. "If you ever need me again, you have the right number now." Amina looked up at the stars over Seoul, finally breathing air that didn't taste of fear. The wrong text had ended her old life, but it had given her a world where she would never have to be invisible again.